Welcome to the Library of Awakening, hosted by CyberX, a space where curiosity meets courage and ideas come alive. Here we explore the thoughts that challenge, inspire, and sometimes even unsettle us, because growth often begins with discomfort. So, welcome to the journey. May this space inspire you to ask questions, explore the unknown, and most importantly, to awaken. This is the Library of Awakening. Alrighty, everybody, what is going on? Nope. What is going on, Library of Awakening family? Welcome back to another episode. I have a really great read for you guys today. We're going to be diving into a book that I made a short on just the other day called The Genesis of the Grail Kings. Now, you guys really seemed to like that portion of this book in this particular short here. Got over 500 views, and I got a lot of great positive feedback on this one. So we're going to dive into chapter one of this book. And if you guys like the read, let me know in the comments down below if you all want me to continue to further reading through some more chapters. So heading over to the CyberX Discord and opening this book today, before Adam, before the Bible, before religion, civilization was already advanced, organized, and ruled by kings, Anunnaki kings, or, we'll get into that. I'm sure we covered that a little bit more, but we're not going to discuss particularly about the kings today. But those whose legacy was later rewritten, in a sense. And this chapter exposes where history ends, mythology begins, and why the true origins of civilization were never meant to be taught. So, lock in with me today. Again, you guys can find all these books inside the private CyberX Discord by heading over to cyberxtrading.com. There's so many books in here that I cannot wait to dive into with you guys on the Library of Awakening. But this is the one that we're going to be reading thoroughly through today. Lawrence Gardner, The Astonishing Story of the Ancient Bloodline of Jesus Christ and the True Heritage of the Holy Grail. I have the physical copy of this one. This was a phenomenal read. Lawrence Gardner nails a lot of things on the head. Again, one of those books where when you're doing this type of research, you need to be able to discern some of the information that is relevant to your journey and some of the information that might not be, that other authors have touched on and kind of gone a little bit deeper down into. All right. But Genesis of the Grail Kings. Let's dive into this one today. All right. So I have a little bit of time today to spend with you guys. We're going to get through chapter one at least today. We'll see how the time goes after we get through chapter one. If we can finish chapter one in under 30 minutes, then maybe I'll slap on chapter two within today's video breakdown, but we'll see how we go for time here in just a couple of pages. All right. So scrolling up to the very top of this, we're going to be reading chapter one, The Cradle of Civilization. I thought that I might as well just dive into chapter one before I open the door for any other later chapters that we might cover and read. Dawn of the Dragon. In Bloodline of the Holy Grail, which is another one of his books, which is phenomenal. We'll dive into that one as well here on this channel. We considered the line of messianic kingly descent from the family of Jesus, the dynastic bloodline, which became known as the Sangreal or the Blood Royal. This was the line of King David of Judah, the family whose heirs from the time of Jesus were hounded by the Christian church authorities for centuries. But what is it that made this sovereign line so special in the first place? What was the original legacy of their messianic kingship? The legacy so feared by the Orthodox establishment. By studying the pre-biblical text, the answer to these questions are stunningly revealed, but not necessarily in a form that we might expect. No longer are Adam, Noah, Abraham, and the well-known characters of Genesis a humble band of territorial pioneers. Instead, they emerge as a formidable cast of players in one of history's most enlightening portrayals, for it was they who witnessed the astonishing dawn of the Grail Kings, the original house of the dragon. From the very earliest recorded times, dragons have featured at the forefront of cultural lore, where they have been portrayed in various conflicting guises. The ancient Greeks believed that dragons were benevolent creatures with the ability to convey the wisdom and secrets of life, while in contrast, the early Hebrews saw dragons as the meddlesome herbivores of sin. Sorry if you guys can hear the ice cream truck outside. I can hear it right now. So there's background noise. I apologize. Let's continue. The mighty dragon was the emblem of the Chinese Empire, being a national symbol of good fortune. And outside the Hebrew tradition, dragons were generally seen as the guardians of universal knowledge and the benign protectors of humankind. I'm going to do my best not to stumble on words as I'm short for time today, but I wanted to get something out to you guys. I want to read thoroughly through this, but pick up the pace a little bit. All right. So bear with me. To the Celtic races of Europe, the dragon was the ultimate symbol of sovereignty, hence the Dark Age pendragons, head dragons or kings of kings. But in AD 49-4 or 494, Pope Gelasius I challenged the Celtic Church by canonizing a certain bishop, George of Alexandria, who was said to have slain a dragon. This violent and unpopular Turkish churchman was reputed to have insulted and persecuted dissenters and was eventually killed by a Palestinian mob in AD 361. He emerged, however, as the famous martyr St. George, with surrounding legends that grew over more exaggerated. At the Council of Oxford in 1222, the year 1222, geez Louise, that was a long time ago, it was proclaimed that St. George's feast day should be the 23rd of April, and in the 14th century, he became the Catholic patron saint of England by decree of King Edward III, Plantagenet. From the 4th century, the Roman Church denounced and terrorized upholders of the Celtic Christian faith. By the way, this gets a lot deeper. This is just like one of those chapters that's got to have a couple of paragraphs to like open the curtain for you, right? So stick with me. The Roman Church denounced and terrorized upholders of the Celtic Christian faith, and in this regard, St. George the Dragon Slayer personified the vengeful Catholic Inquisition against the supporters of the Messianic bloodline. The dragons of the Christian mythology were adopted from those of the Hebrew tradition and are often portrayed with wings and breathing fire. But historically, dragons were the epitome of the royal crocodile or sea serpent, the Bestia Neptunus of the Dark Age Fisher Kings and the medieval Merovingian kings. Merovingian, these words are insane to pronunciate for you guys. The Merovingian kings of the Franks. By way of a manipulated tradition in Western Christendom, the dragon has been portrayed rather differently from its original representation in the Eastern cultures. It has also been diverted into the realms of legend and mythology, whereas it was with the fat of the historical Mesa, sacred dragon or crocodile, that the Egyptian pharaohs were anointed upon coronation. It is an apparent fact that one culture defines as history, another will define as mythology. This is especially the case in religious affairs where opposing cultures are in spiritual conflict. Christians, for example, consider the deities of other beliefs to be mythical, but maintain that their own deity is not. The same might, of course, be said in reverse. So, where in all of this lies the truth, that which is called history? The Oxford English Dictionary defines history as the continuous methodological record of important or public events. Other reference books give similar definitions, and it is evident from these that the term history does not constitute the events themselves, but relates to the documented records of the events. Sometimes these records are compiled firsthand, and sometimes second or third hand. But whatever the case, they are always subject to bias, opinion, and vested interest. When history deals with the matters of conflict, whether military, political, social, or religious, then it becomes a device for conveying sectarian or national leaning, and the details of individual events vary in accordance with the attitudes, commissions, and objectives of the writers concerned. Hence, the history of, say, a war will be differently perceived by each opposing side, as will the histories of political or religious disputes. The formal overall history that one learns is, therefore, that which has been approved by one's governing establishment. That is a highlight right there. It is authorized, countenanced, sanctioned, and academically warranted, but it is not necessarily the explicit truth. It is truth tempered by partisan interpretation and subjective opinion. When documentary records are related to matters of science, then it is automatically constrained by ongoing research, and it can only communicate the facts as they are known at the time of writing. Only a few decades ago, it was, as far as anyone knew, quite impossible to converse with someone thousands of miles away. It was equally impossible to fly over the oceans or to watch relayed coverage of live events from around the world. Now, such things are not only possible, but commonplace, and the coming century will undoubtedly hold its own share of possibilities that were hit hero regarding as impossible. By virtue of this, history cannot afford to be dogmatic. It can only record given points of view at given points in time because there are always areas of uncertainty and elements of the unknown which have to be conceded. When some huge, unfathomable bone, there's that word again, unfathomable bones were unearthed in China 2,000 years ago, they were recorded as being the bones of a dragon, where it was traditionally thought that a great dragon's tail had marked the river channels which drained the canal in the land in primeval times. We now know that these are to be dinosaur bones, but the people of the era could not possibly have identified them as such because they had no knowledge that dinosaurs ever existed. In fact, everything that we know today about dinosaurs and their environment has been learned since around the 1820s. Their name comes from the Greek dinos saurus, meaning terrible lizard. Sometimes, for want of any comparative record, certain documented information is taken on board as history until a related and perhaps contradictory discovery sheds new light on the subject. In this regard, the Old Testament of the Jewish and Christian Bibles holds a primary position, for just like the Chinese dinosaur bones, no one had access to any more specific information through the same 2,000 years. The Old Testament as we have come to know it was a largely retrospective work, first compiled between the 6th and 2nd centuries BC, but relating to the events of hundreds and even thousands of years before. That is a huge statement that a lot of religious people don't know. They don't actually know when the biblical text was, formulated. I'll read that again. The Old Testament as we have come to know it was largely retrospective work, first compiled between the 6th and 2nd centuries BC. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's 6 to 400 BC, but related to the events of hundreds and even thousands of years before. They are references within the Old Testament to a number of material sources, but since these earlier works have not been available, the best that generations of people could do was to take the scripture as read, to treat it as being symbolic, or perhaps to ignore it altogether. The difference between the Bible and much other history lies, however, in the word scripture. For the Old Testament was not only a work of ancestral record, but became the basis for an evolving widespread religious doctrine. It was not until the 1850s that documentary evidence of pre biblical history first came to light, and this was followed 20 years later by some published texts. Not until the late 1920s were the first in depth translations released into the public domain, translations of scribal records considerably older than the original Old Testament. As the archaeologists progressed their excavations, these ancient clay tablets and engraved cylinders emerged in their tens of thousands from every Bible lands of Adam, or from the very Bible lands of Adam. Let me reread that. As the archaeologists progressed their excavations, these ancient clay tablets and engraved cylinders emerged in their tens of thousands from the very Bible lands of Adam, Noah, and Abraham, and they were in large measure contemporary with the Old Testament's patriarchal and dynastic eras. More importantly, and perhaps surprisingly to some, many of their accounts were immediately familiar, and it soon became obvious that these were the models for stories written down in retrospect by Israelite compilers of Genesis. Throughout the best part of the Common Era, these informative texts had been hidden, unbeknown to anyone, beneath the Mesopotamian and Syrian deserts, and their discovery, like the discovery of dinosaurs, should have been greeted with enthusiasm by all, but it was not. The historical accounts were familiar, and the characters and places were recognizable as being Old Testament prototypes, but the literal emphasis was so different from the approved scripture that indoctrinated societies and its governing authorities felt immediately threatened. Let me reread that. The historical accounts were familiar and the characters and places were recognizable as being the Old Testament prototypes, but the literal emphasis were so different from the approved scripture that indoctrinated society and its governing authorities felt immediately threatened. Quite suddenly, it was clear that the long supposed authentic history of the Bible was not authentic at all. It had been contrived by adjusting original records to suit an emergent religious movement from 2,500 years ago. This movement, at first a localized sectarian Hebrew cult, had subsequently expanded into mainstream Judaism and then branched off into Christianity, with the Old Testament becoming a common factor of teaching. But what had also transpired was that this series of books, originally compiled to underpin a cultural doctrine in troubled times, had become a repository of established dogma, which had itself become regarded as absolute history. As previously stated, history cannot afford to be dogmatic, but it was too late. The die had been cast through the religious application. Even now, the dogma of contrived scriptural history is still taught in our schoolrooms and churches. While the original documents from which the scripture was constructed are ignored, this is particularly unfortunate because the more ancient documents are, far more explicit than the Old Testament in their detailing of the patriarchal era. In these texts, the Bible stories are not only placed in a better chronological context, but their social and political relevance becomes far more understandable. In our quest for the Messianic dragon heritage, we shall be delving back into the ancient origins of the kingly tradition, back into the distant world of Genesis, to the time of Adam and beyond. In order to set the scene, it is first necessary to establish our geographical base, since Old Testament history spans three distinct regions: Mesopotamia, the land encompassed by present day Iraq, been there before, Canaan, Palestine, and Egypt. This overall territory, with the Mediterranean Sea bordered Egypt and Canaan, includes the three great rivers. In the west is the north flowing Nile, while in the east the Tigris and Euphrates run south into the Persian Gulf. So interesting when I read these books and I have memories back from when I was in the military, and I never really truly realized where I was. And then having this awakening and having memories from back when I was in the military, I remember how many like ancient monuments and sculptures were over there of this type of stuff. And it's just so interesting now looking back. I wish that I was awake and aware to this type of information back when I served in the military, because it would have just been, in my personal opinion, such a more invigorating experience compared to what it was. All right. From about 10,000 BC towards the end of the last ice age, this Near Eastern land mass was especially suited to the irrigation, particularly in its river plateau and delta regions. In consequence, it was the earliest cradle of civilization, and for reasons of both culture and agriculture, it has been dubbed the Fertile Crescent. You can see that here. In Mesopotamia, the temperate, moist conditions gave rise to large tracts of open woodland and a variety of long grasses, where developed to produce barley and wheat on a large scale, or were developed to deliver barley and wheat on a large scale. Harvesting of several crops can also be traced back to Canaan in about 10,000 BC, to northern Syria around 9,000 BC, and to the Jordan Valley in 8,000 BC. As the cereal and grain culture advanced by way of improved seeding, fertilization and ripening methods, so too were pulses and looms, such as peas and lentils, cultivated. In this well nurtured grazing environment, certain animals were tamed and herded, with gazelles and goats being the primary meat providers. While the later were also used for milking, sheep farming was additionally popular in northern Mesopotamia from about 9000 BC, and from around 6000 BC, pigs, dogs, and cattle were also domesticated. Throughout this period, the local farming communities were settled into villages and townships with houses commonly built of mud brick. The settlements were often set upon hills surrounded by trenches for protection against wild animals, and the domestic herds were further sheltered within stockades. Because of the extensive grain crops, stone grinding was an early introduction, as with the manufacture and use of pottery, and trade between communities was also encouraged. To expedite this trade, various natural resources were frequently used as means of exchange, particularly decorative items such as volcanic glass shells and semi precious stones. The era from 8000 BC was that which we generally classify as the New Stone Age. But soon after 6500 BC, the advanced culture of the Fertile Crescent had moved into the Bronze Age, the first age of metallurgy, wherein copper was alloyed with tin to produce the highly durable bronze. The singularly impressive level of Near Eastern advancement becomes apparent when one realizes that, in contrast, the oldest pottery unearthed in Britain dates back only to about 2500 BC, and the earliest barley farming commenced about half a century later. Britain did not enter the Bronze Age until the Belgic tribes arrived in about 2000 BC. By 6000 BC, the people of Mesopotamia Near East were using ships on the open sea, while Britain was still 4,000 years away from a simple weaving industry. It therefore comes as no surprise that the most prominent stories of early beginnings emerge from the Bible lands of the Fertile Crescent. For as far as the people of those lands were concerned, the outside world was still asleep in the forlorn and primitive environment. Indeed, it can be said with no reserve whatever that cultural history certainly began in those very countries described in the book of Genesis. The title Genesis was introduced by Greek Bible translators in the 3rd century BC and relates to origin or beginning. The Hebrew opening for the book was Bereshit or Bereshit, at the beginning. It is not until we reach the 19th patriarchal generation of the Genesis account that Canaan and Egypt begin to feature in the narrative. This occurs after Abraham's emigration from his native Mesopotamia, and so it is in Mesopotamia that our story must begin. In southern Mesopotamia, to be precise, for in Genesis 11:31, we are told that Abraham, originally called Abram or Abram, came from Ur of the Chaldees. Earlier biblical references back to the time of Adam cement the family tradition very firmly in the Tigris Euphrates region above the Persian Gulf. Mind you, again, the chapter of this book is the bloodline of Jesus Christ. So it's literally taking you all the way back to the beginning. And that's how each of these chapters is formulated. When I read the physical copy, it's literally structured in a way for you to maybe you're not understanding why it's breaking all this down for you now, but it's literally talking about everything from the top down to give you a full blown perspective on where we're at now. It's pretty crazy. The name Mesopotamia means land between the rivers, and it was technically the country between the Tigris and Euphrates. But geographically, the Mesopotamia boundaries enveloped these two rivers from the northern Taurus Mountains down to the Gulf. Northern Mesopotamia is perhaps better known as Assyria, while the central region was called Akkad, wherein sits present day Baghdad, north of Babylon. Soon after 4000 BC, southern Mesopotamia was identified as Sumer, pronounced Shumer, and it was here that the early patriarchs prevailed. One of the foremost cities of the ancient Sumer was Uruk, modern day Warka, from which derived the country's eventual name of Iraq. Southeast of Uruk was the city of Ur in the Sumerian region of Chaldea, the Chaldees. These days, the Persian Gulf sweeps below Iraq to Iran or Persia from northern Kuwait. But in those early times, the Gulf extended a good deal further inland, so that Ur was practically on the coast. The word city is not used lightly in this context, for these important centers were undeniably cities from about 3800 BC. In Uruk, with its great temple, was the first true city on earth. The municipal city with community councils had actually evolved from about 5500 BC, when the farming Haliphans of Tel Halaf introduced cobbled streets and drainage systems more than 3,000 years before the primitive Stonehenge is reckoned to have been constructed in Britain, at which time Western Europeans had barely invented the crude wooden plow. In the Mesopotamian town of Arpicia, there were large beehive shaped public buildings called tholi, measuring on average about 32 feet in diameter. One of the main Halafan communities near subsequent was established as a delta settlement at Ubaid, a noted center of metallurgy and pottery, and nearby emerged Sumer's most sacred city of Eridu. Other important cities of the area were Kish, Nippur, Erech, Lagesh, and Larsa. And just as today's cities are distinguished by their great cathedrals, so too did these highly cultural centers have their richly decorated skyward temples. It will perhaps have been noticed that although Mesopotamia was a world leader in numerous aspects from around 10,000 BC, there appears to have been a very marked further advancement from about 4000 BC, when the southern Mesopotamia became identified as Sumer and the truly municipal cities flourished. By that time, they were formally recognized as city states, which operated as individual kingdoms. And it is the story of the amazing rise of Sumer which provides the very thrust of the patriarchal narrative in Genesis. This sudden cultural expansion was not simply a matter of general evolvement. It was a mighty technical and academic revolution which has long baffled scholars and historians worldwide. So, hopefully, you guys enjoyed this read today, The Cradle of Civilization and the Genesis of the Grail Kings. This is a phenomenal book. I mean, just real quick, taking a look at some of these chapters here. We just read chapter 1. You have Like Migrating Birds, the Adamite Chronicles, of the Chaldees, the Great Flood, the Hebrew tradition, the Old Testament, the Garden of Eden. This section here is really deep, and it references a lot to the book that I was telling you about, The Genius of the Few, that eventually we'll try to get into a couple of chapters of once I'm finished reading the physical book. But yeah, just really juicy information. It goes into the Nephilim, the Watchers, the missing link. This book puts a lot of things into perspective. So maybe we'll get into another couple chapters in the coming days ahead. That is all the time that I have for you guys today. Remember, as always, you guys can always find these books inside the private CyberX Discord within the Library of Awakening section. Hundreds of thousands of books shared in here on a consistent basis. We'd love to have you on the team in 2026. We'd love to have you on the team in 2026. With that being said, many blessings to you guys. Do me a favor before you head off, smash that thumbs up button and subscribe to the platform. We do appreciate the love and the support. Leave a comment down below if you guys enjoyed this read. If you want to, read a couple of more chapters in this particular book with me, we will do so in future videos ahead. If I see in the comments down below that this one interests you, as always, many blessings, be cognizant, be aware, and I'll see you guys in the next video breakdown. I know some of the perspectives that I share may be as challenging for you as they once were for me, but isn't that the beauty of exploration? Every perspective, no matter how unconventional, has something valuable to contribute to it if it's shared. Knowledge is not absolute. It's a living, breathing phenomena, shaped and reshaped over time. The important thing is not always be right, but to always be curious. Explore freely, share boldly, and learn deeply. And don't rely solely on others to validate your discoveries. Stand firm in integrity, even in the face of criticism. Remember that growth always means embracing the humility to admit when we're wrong. Learning from our errors is not a setback, it's the very essence of our progress. So, welcome to the journey. May this space inspire you to ask questions, explore the unknown, and most importantly, to awaken. This is the Library of Awakening,